The classes in the world of Vanilla Warcraft truly stand out from other versions of the game. They were from a time when the game was approached very differently, and getting those small incremental upgrades to your class as a whole just felt so good to do. Whether it was learning a brand new spell for the first time and going out to test it, getting a new rank of an ability, or unlocking your all-important level 40 talents such as Mortal Strike, Shadow Form, Bestial Wrath, or more. There's so much to like about how the classes ended up being in vanilla. It may not always be the most convenient that your class doesn't excel at everything and feels as though it can't do everything, but it certainly makes things feel unique. Still, classes changed a bunch from World of Warcraft's alpha to its eventual release in 2004, and today I wanted to show you a few obscure or perhaps lesser known things about each of Vanilla's classes so you can really get an idea of just how different things ended up being. With that said, here's a few facts about each of Vanilla's classes that you may or may not have known about. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev aims to give you the tools to get fully on board with the Python and Go programming languages in order to forge a career in back-end web development. It keeps things a bit more interactive than many online learning courses by treating this process like a proper RPG, with experience, leaderboards, achievements, and more. It's just that bit extra to keep things interesting and you motivated to progress. Speaking of progress, Boot.dev believes in hands-on learning, and one of the key things they want to get you doing is writing tons of your own code so you really understand it. But if you do get stuck, there's plenty of help available too, such as Boots the Bear, who will help via asking you more questions to help you understand what you're doing rather than just handing you the answers in the first place. But even if you just want to check Boot.dev out before committing, it is risk-free. All the content is free to read and watch in guest mode, and there is a 30 days no questions asked refund policy, as well as a free demo of every course and its interactive features. Click the link in the description box and use my code WILLY to get 25% off your first month, or even your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Many thanks to Boot.dev for the continued support. Let's get on back to WoW. Let's start off with a mage today, and mages used to have even better utility than what they ended up shipping with. It's crazy to think you have a class here that can make their own food and water, mana gems, portals, and teleport, and it used to be even better than that utility-wise. Mages used to be able to do lockpicking as well, and this was called Khadgar's Unlocking, where they would conjure different ranks of keys that would be able to open different level chests and doors. Though this was removed sometime during the alpha, and I suppose Blizzard decided that some other classes should be able to do some things as well, maybe such as a rogue for lockpicking, for example. Mages used to have 2 ranks of an invisibility spell as well, which will last for a long time but could randomly end early. Obviously, a mage popping out of nowhere in invisibility, then pompiring you or polymorphing you to enter combat would be seriously overpowered as well. So this ability was eventually removed, but it did make a comeback in TBC and beyond in a bit more of a balanced way. Mages also had an ability called Phantasm. They got a new rank of this every 8 levels, starting at level 14 and ending at 38. This would summon a sort of ghost which would go and attack people, which is a bit of an odd addition for the Mage's toolkit and is another one that was removed pre-launch. For priests, at one point during the WoW alpha, they used to have a long duration CC effect called Sleep, and in fact there was a bit of a back and forth between them having this ability and mages having it as their long duration CC instead of polymorph. Sleep started off as a priest ability and then was moved to mage, and then was later moved back to priest, at which point mages were given polymorph. But then of course, as we now know from launch, Sleep was eventually moved from the priest class as well. But this is why you see certain NPCs who are associated with priests or maybe paladins casting Sleep within the game, and instead priests would have CC effects such as mind control and shackle undead, which lasted for a long time. Discipline was also kind of a weird caster melee hybrid in its very early versions, kind of like a holy monk which would fight with their fists but also cast a bunch of spells. And if you check out a really early version of the discipline tree, it kind of makes sense. They have a lot of things which are instant cast or reduce the mana cost of their instant casts, or focus a bit more on priest's utility such as dispelling or burning mana. And the final talent point in this tree used to be Divine Spirit before it was revamped later on to be more of a traditional caster type healer. Whilst the idea was there for them to be somewhat melee and maybe even to tank to some extent due to the extra threat from from Mind Blast, there was no real support added in for melee abilities, so I think this idea was canned pretty early on. In a very early version of Warlock, instead of their imp having Flame Shield, which of course reflects minor damage onto an enemy, instead they had Flame Blade, and you'd imagine they'd have conjured up a sword and then gone to hit something with it, which does sound kind of cool to be honest, but I guess this would have meant your imp would have been going into melee range to use it, and your imp already kind of dies to any damage whatsoever, so this probably wouldn't have been for the best. Also in vanilla, I can't help but get that feeling as though some of the higher level Warlock demons are a bit underused. For example, when your Infernal's summoned, it's not under your control and you have to subjugate it. On the unofficial hardcore servers, people used to go around griefing with this. They'd go over to Elwyn Forest, drop an Infernal on someone's head, and there's not really that much you can do about it. Equally, the Doomguard was much more dangerous and needed 5 people to complete the ritual, one of whom would be sacrificed during the ritual. And whilst the Doomguard was quite powerful in vanilla, it was never really used for this reason, just because of the inconvenience of summoning it. Maybe one day we'll see a bit more utility from these high level demons for the Warlock. Also, you may not have known that whilst you can learn to summon these 2 demons from quests, you can also go and farm mobs out in the open world which will drop grimoires. The Infernal is dropped by Scar Shield Warlocks, which are quite soloable by the way, and the Doomguard from the elite demons in Blasted Lands near where Kazakh is. These are not so soloable. Again, it's a bit of a shame that the high level demons don't have more uses in the game. Maybe we'll see this change one day. Next up we have Druid, and did you know that Tranquility seemed to be a lot stronger once upon a time, as it would still be an ability with a long cooldown, but it had a 30-second duration, so you could really just plant a Druid somewhere, have them trank, and people's health will be good for so long. Also, their talent trees used to be very different. At the end of the restoration tree, instead of finding Swiftmend, you'd have Innovate there, and instead of Moonkin form as the final talent point for balance, you would have Hurricane, and it's the version of Hurricane that vanilla shipped with, where frankly, it's not very good, mainly because it costs way too much mana and has a 1-minute cooldown. Imagine for a while during the WoW Alpha that Druid didn't even have Moonkin form. We really could have ended up with such a different game. For Rogue, they used to have a combo point builder witch stunned called Trip, which sounds hilariously not fun to play against. Also, if it's called Trip, it's probably some variation of a knockdown effect which don't typically suffer from diminishing returns as other CC effects do due to the animation you have to go through. Imagine getting tripped up 5 times in a row straight into a kidney shot. You will literally not be able to play the game, even more so than you already can't versus rogues. And up to patch 0.8, rogues, and hunters for that matter, could use a smaller variation of a shield called a buckler, which was designed to give them extra defense and a bit more armor, but there was no real ability support from anything else they had in their toolkit, so it was eventually removed. On this same patch, bucklers were removed entirely and just all replaced with shields, and shields were also enabled for Shaman. For the hunter, survival used to be a melee focused talent tree all the way down. There were talents which gave loads of bonuses to melee stats, reduced cooldowns, extra hit chance, extra crit chance, all of that good stuff. And their final talent was Lacerate, which is basically the same as Rend, it's just an ability you press and it puts a bleed on the enemy. And if it's anything like Rend, or well, just other bleeds in Classic in general, then it wouldn't have really scaled with anything and would have been absolutely terrible. In fact, this whole melee identity for the hunter back then, I have to imagine was absolutely terrible, especially when you compare it to its ranged counterparts. Until we got to Legion, that is, and then Blizzard changed survival into a melee spec once again, and they even brought back Lacerate, working pretty much in the same way that it did during the WoW Alpha, and then they ended up removing Lacerate again in BFA. I guess hunters just can't have this ability. During the WoW Alpha, hunters used to have way more abilities too, such as Running Shot, which, as the name suggests, is a shot that you could use whilst moving, or Blinding Shot, which would reduce enemies' hit chance for a short duration. I think in the end Blizzard pruned down a lot of these extra abilities just to try and simplify their class. Hunter, despite its simple appearance, can be, at least I find, one of the classes you need a few more keybinds on. The Shaman had some crazy different abilities pre-launch. One of them was Serpent Totem that would summon a totem that would attack nearby enemies. Judging from the icon here, this was eventually changed into Flame Tongue Totem, and having a fire-based totem that attacks nearby enemies sounds a lot like your regular old Searing Totem. Then again, different races within the game have always had slightly different totems. Maybe it would be nice if one day you can customize them a little bit more than that. Shamans also had Molten Blast, which is notably a spell which we've had return in Season of Discovery, but in a different way I think. This version of Molten Blast just looked like a single target spell spell which did some minor fire damage, though it could have been early inspiration for what Lava Burst eventually became in Wrath of the Lich King. And Shamans also had Lightning Storm that would do AoE damage in an area. This was possibly replaced by Chain Lightning, though I'm not 100% sure if they already had this ability. Functionally, it seems quite similar to what Hurricane would have already been for Balance Druids, which was already a capstone talent, remember, so I guess Blizzard didn't want to have two classes doing more or less the exact same AoE nature damage spell. Paladins used to be so different in the earlier versions of World of Warcraft. Blessing of Kings, for example, used to be the final talent point in the Retribution tree. Repentance still existed too, and there was the final point for protection. Imagine if Vanilla shipped with Ret being the only spec which could access Blessing of Kings. Retribution Paladins would be an absolutely mandatory one-of in every single raid. Also, Consecration used to be in the Retribution tree as well. You used to be able to buff seals on other players during the WoW Alpha, and your Judgment ability did exist, but it was a lot more similar to what Holy Wrath ended up being. And also for Paladins, Greater Blessings didn't exist until patch 1.9. That's when AQ was released. So up to then, all they had was 5-minute blessings in a 40-player raid environment. You were truly playing the buff of a people class, put it like that. And last but not least, we have the Warrior. Bloodthirst was the final talent for Fury, but it was very different from the ability you know. It made your next attack do 100% bonus damage after landing a killing blow. This would have been interesting to try and min-max and make the most of in PvE, and in PvP you'd probably be one-shotting Clothies with this proc up, or near enough. Enrage in the Fury tree, interestingly, would also give a bonus 40% to physical damage after receiving a crit, which is a pretty massive number. Up to patch 0.10, which is pretty late in the alpha by the way, charge was still usable in combat. Warriors nearly lived in a world where you could charge in combat and you had intercept. This would have been an absolutely massive buff for them, of course. And your final talent in the protection tree was also quite different, and you didn't have Shield Slam. Instead, you had Shield Discipline, which cost 15 rage, had a 20-second duration and a 45-second cooldown. It increased the damage absorbed by your shield by 50% and increased the damage of Shield Bash by 200%. And on paper, this sounds pretty good, but Shield Bash is your interrupt ability, remember, and it does kind of, well, next to no damage. So next to nothing times 200% is still pretty much next to nothing. Also in Vanilla, shields absorbed a flat amount of damage, not a percentage. So if you're fighting a boss, your shield's damage absorption was doing pretty much nothing. However, if you were fighting lots of low-level enemies or enemies which hit fast and did a little bit of damage, it was very good. Unfortunately, when shields mattered most of the time, you'd be fighting bosses, which ultimately made them not great. Ultimately, Blizzard would remove this talent and replace it with Shield Slam, but as we now know today, the protection tree, when it comes to tanking, still just isn't very good. Turns out you need to do a lot of damage to generate threat in Vanilla, and the protection tree does not encourage you to do that. And that's it, just a few random different things about each class which you may or may not have known about. Is there anything else you'd have added for each class, and is there anything which you wish that they would have kept in the game? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.